Hey guys, it's Lulu. Anton continued in medical school as a fair to middling student. A new stage in his life began in 1953 when, having passed his first exams, he left the house on Pololand and rented an apartment in the center of town. In this small dark place above a fish store on a little street between the Prinzengrat and the Kiesergrat were only 5 or 6 meters separated him from his neighbors across the way. The Harlem of 1945 sank even more into the background. The process of putting Harlem behind him resembled the changes a man goes through when he divorces. He takes a girlfriend to forget his wife, but just doing that prolongs the connection with the wife. Possibly things would work out only with the next girlfriend, although the third one has the best chance. Boundaries have to be continually sealed off, but it's a hopeless job, for everything touches everything else in this world. A beginning never disappears, not even with the ending. Every few months or so, he suffered from a day-long bout of migraine that forced him to lie down in the dark, though it hardly ever made him vomit. He read a lot, but never about the war, and once he published a few poems about nature in a student magazine under the name of Anton Peter. He played the piano with a preference for Schumann and enjoyed attending concerts. He had avoided going to the theater ever since, for incomprehensible reasons. He had felt indisposed during a splendid performance of Chekhov's Cherry Orchard, directed by Sharoff. During a scene where a man sat at the table with a bowed head while a woman outside on a terrace shouted at someone, Anton was overcome by a sense of something dreadful, something elusive, but so overwhelming that he might have to leave at once. Outside in the street with the crowds, trolleys, and cars, his symptoms disappeared quickly and completely. A few minutes later, he wondered if there had been anything to them. Every week he went to the Pollen on his motor scooter with a bag full of dirty laundry. Usually he stayed there for dinner, and as time went by he began to notice the extreme orderliness of this well-to-do middle-class life. The way everything was in its place, nothing ever broken, unpainted, improvised, or second-rate. Food was served in dishes, wine in decanters, jackets were never removed, or ties loosened. Whenever his aunt or uncle appeared to come to his apartment, he could tell by their faces that it gave them the opposite impression. Then his uncle would say that he too had been a student once. In 1956, he had passed his final exams and began to serve his internships in several hospitals. He had already decided to specialize in anesthesia. He knew that he could earn twice, even 3 times as much as if he became an internist or cardiologist with a private practice. But then he would have less time to himself and would probably develop an ulcer or heart disease, whereas an anesthesiologist could close the hospital doors behind him after an operation was finished. So could surgeons, of course, but surgery was only for butchers. And there were not only negative reasons for his choice of anesthesiology. He was fascinated by the delicate equilibrium that must be maintained whenever the butchers planted their knives in someone. This balancing on the edge between life and death, and his responsibility for the poor human being, helpless in unconsciousness, he had, besides the more or less mystical notion that the narcotics did not make the patient insensitive to pain so much as unable to express that pain, and that although drugs erased the memory of pain, the patient was nevertheless changed by it. When patients woke up, it always seemed evident that they had been suffering. But when he spoke of this theory once, his colleagues who were talking about yachting, the way they looked at him suggested he had better keep his thoughts to himself if he wanted to remain in the club. And then there was politics. The talk went on forever, but he hardly bothered to follow it, especially on a national level. Though he read the headlines, he forgot them at once. When an English colleague questioned him about the Dutch system of government, Anton knew very little, no more about the German or French. As to the newspaper, he spent most of his time trying to solve the daily crossword puzzle. He couldn't resist them and had become an expert. Whenever he found an unsolved puzzle in a paper in some waiting room, it became his ambition to decipher the clue that had stymied the previous person. After he had filled all the blanks, he surveyed the completed square with satisfaction. The fact that most letters had a double function in both a horizontal and vertical word, and that these words were paired in a mysterious way, pleased him no end. It had something to do with poetry. But in that same year, 1956, the time came for him to vote in the elections. At his weekly dinner in the Apollon, his uncle asked him which party he would endorse. He said it would probably be the Liberals. When his uncle asked why, Anton had no better reason than his friends did. This was the worst possible reason. According to Van Lept, who managed to change Anton's mind in a few minutes, present-day liberalism, he said, combined a fundamental pessimism about social solidarity with the idea that the individual must remain as free as possible, but a person is either a pessimist who favors endorsed order or an optimist who favors freedom. It is impossible to be both at once. One cannot combine the pessimism of socialism with the optimism of anarchy. And yet, this is what liberalism does. Therefore, it is very simple, he said. You have only to decide whether you are an optimist or a pessimist. Which is it? Anton looked at him briefly, lowered his eyes again, and said, pessimist. And so he voted for the Social Democrats, like his uncle, who was one of those important party leaders from whom burgomasters and ministers are chosen. Only later did Anton realize that almost nobody voted rationally, but simply out of self-interest, or because he felt an affinity for the members of a certain party, or because the leading candidate inspired confidence. It was physiobiological in a way. In a subsequent election, he voted somewhat more conservatively, for a newly founded party which claimed that the difference between right and left was obsolete. Still, national politics meant little to him, about as much as paper airplanes would mean to the survivor of a plane crash. Chapter 2. Later that year, he became more aware of communism, and at the same time of international politics. For the second half of 1956, provided a veritable orgy for newspaper readers. Unrest in Poland, scandals within the royal family, the French and English attack on Egypt, and the revolution in Hungary and the intervention of the Soviet Union, the landing of Fidel Castro in Cuba. A few weeks before this bravura performance in the Caribbean, the rumble of the Russian tanks had rolled into Budapest still echoed within Holland, and nowhere more audibly than around the corner from Anton's apartment. There, in a large 18th century building called Felix Meritis, were the headquarters of the Communist Party. Unruly mobs roamed the city, destroying everything that had anything to do with the communists. And from their bookstore to the windows of their homes, the crowds were aided by the press, which published addresses under the pretense of objective reporting. A paper would announce that the home of this or that party leader on such and such street had been only slightly damaged, and the next day the damage would be more extensive. After completing all this work, mobs of thousands gathered in front of the Felix Meritis building on the Kaisergrat and besieged it continuously for 48 hours. By then, the building had become a fortress. Downstairs, the windows were boarded up. None of the second-floor areas were still undamaged, and men in helmets were visible on the roof. Women, too, could be seen at times, and the crowds jeered at them with hostility. People who wanted to go in or out of the building made sure they had police protection. Policemen with rubber-clipped clubs and drawn guns tried to hold the crowd to the opposite side of the canal, but the police were too in danger from stones flying through the air. The men on the roof were throwing back the stones that had landed inside the building. Now and then, they aimed fire hoses at small groups that came too close. A gray police boat patrolled the canal to fish out people who had fallen in the water. Anton was uninterested in all this. He would never have taken part. He even avoided conversations about it. Somehow he couldn't help thinking that though it was all pretty horrible, it was only child's play, really. Besides, he got the impression that, in a way, many people were delighted with what had happened in Budapest because it confirmed their opinions about communism. The worst problem for him was the constant racket. Since his own narrow street provided access to the back of the Felix Baroness building on the Prinzregrat, demonstrators also gathered there and even threw Molotov cocktails, as the fishman told him. In desperation, one evening, he went to the movies to see The Seventh Seal. When he came home, he put on loud music, Mahler's Second Symphony, but the noise didn't let up all night, and he decided to spend the following night in the Apollon, where everything was peaceful. When the time came, however, he couldn't believe that the uproar would go on for another night, so he went home as usual after work. It was dusk, and candles were burning at many windows. The flag hung at half-mast from countless houses. He parked his scooter a few blocks away, so it wouldn't be damaged by the mob, and walked his little street. The tumult had grown, if anything. He had trouble getting to his house through the crowd, and just as he reached the doorway, all hell broke loose. Police cars from the Kiesergrat suddenly appeared and dove into the bomb with blasting sirens and blazing lights, stepping on the gas, slamming the brakes, then revving up again. Policemen on horseback with drawn swords now invaded the street, and motorcycles with sidecars rode up and down the sidewalks while helmeted policemen leaned out of them and hit people with the handles of long black poles. Panic broke out, but to his surprise, Anton noticed that he, in contrast, became calmer. He had felt upset at first, yet now, being trampled, people bleeding, and trying to reach safety, he was pervaded by a strange indifference. His doorway, which also led to the entrance of the fish store, was only about 2 meters square. Now a dozen people stood in it, crowding him against his front door. He already had his key in his hand, but he realized that even if he could turn around, he mustn't open the door. If he did, the staircase in his rooms would be invaded within minutes. And when the people left, all his possessions would have disappeared. In front of him stood a big fellow whose strong back was crushing Anton against the door with all its might. But of course it only seemed that way, for the man was being crushed himself. His hand gripped a big gray rock, which he had to hold up over his shoulder for lack of room. To protect his nose and in order not to suffocate, Anton turned his head to the side. But from the corner of his eye, he saw the man's dirty nails and the calluses on his fingers. Suddenly, everyone ran out of the doorway. The man in front turned around briefly to see who he had felt at his back all this time, stepped out into the street and turned around again and stood still. "Hello, Ton," he said. Anton looked into the wide, coarse face. Suddenly he knew. "Hello, Fake."
For a few seconds they'd eyed each other. Fake with the stone in his hand, Anton with the key. There was still movement on the street, but the center of the violence had shifted to Prinzregrat. "Come on up," said Anton. Fake hesitated. He looked to right and left, as if reluctant to leave the excitement, but understood that he could not very well avoid it. Just for a minute, then. When Anton heard the heavy footsteps following him on the stairs, he could hardly believe it was happening. He had never thought about Fake Plog again, yet Fake, too, had gone on existing and was still present in this world. They didn't shake hands. What were they supposed to talk about? Why in the hell had he invited him in? He switched on the light and drew the curtains. You want a drink? To his horror, Fake put the stone on the grand piano Anton had been given for his birthday. He didn't slam it down, but Anton could hear that it scratched the lacquer. A beer, if you've got it. For himself, Anton poured a glass of wine out of the bottle left from last night. Ill at ease, Fake tried to get comfortable in the canvas chair that looked like a huge butterfly. Anton saw it in the black couch with the worn-out springs. Cheers, he said, and wondered what to say next. Fake briefly lifted his glass, then emptied half of it, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked at the bookcase and the shelf with the sextants. Students, I suppose? Anton nodded. Fake nodded back. He shifted, straightened, and tried to get more comfortable. No good? What a lousy chair, said Fake. It's the latest fashion, you know. Come on, sit here. They changed places. Fake stared at him as if he could see him better now. Do you know you haven't changed at all? So I'm told. I recognized you right away. It took me a moment, said Anton. I didn't see your father that often. Fake pulled a pack of tobacco out from his inside pocket and began to roll a cigarette. When Anton offered him a pack of yellow dry, he declined. Maybe Anton shouldn't have said it, but it was true. Fake was the image of his father, only younger and thinner and a bit puffier. Besides, he didn't think it was up to him to be careful of Fake's feelings. He wished the telephone would ring, so he could say to whoever it was he would come to the hospital at once. It was cold and damp in the room. I'll light the stove, he said. He got up and opened the kerosene valve. Fake rolled his cigarette, picked the extra tobacco out of both ends, and stuffed it back into the package, which he had firmly between his ring and little finger. What are you studying? Medicine. I work for a household appliance store, said Fake before Anton got a chance to ask him. Repairs, you know. Anton waited till enough oil had dripped into the stove. In Harlem? Fake looked at him as if he was crazy. Did you think we could go on living in Harlem? How should I know? Can't you imagine that we had to get out of there in a hurry after the war? Yes, I guess so, said Anton. He lifted the lid off the stove and dropped the burning match into it. Where are you living now? In Den Helder. The match went out and he lit a second one. He dropped it and faced his visitor. Did you come to Amsterdam just to throw stones? Yes, said Fake and looked at him. Strange, isn't it? Anton put the lid back on the stove and sat down. If he simply suggested that they put an end to this meeting, Fake would probably get up and go at once. But suddenly he felt stubborn, as if he didn't want Fake to think that he could get rid of him that easily. Is your mother still alive? Fake nodded. Yes, he said after a silence. He made it sound like a kind of admission, as if Anton had asked, Is your mother alive? He hadn't meant it that way, but even as he said it, he realized that perhaps it was what he had meant after all. How come you're working on one of those appliance stores? He asked. You went to high school after all. Only one semester. Why didn't you stay on? Do you really care? Asked Fake, poking a bit of tobacco back into his cigarette with the end of his match. Why would I ask if I didn't? After the war, they arrested my mother and put her into a camp. I ended up in a Catholic boarding school, which was connected to Episcopal Industrial School. So I had to go there, even though I wasn't a Catholic. What was your mother accused of? Asked the gentleman of the special judiciary. They probably suspected her of being married to my father. From his tone, he could tell that Fake had said this before, and it didn't sound as if he had thought it up himself either. And then, after 9 months, they let her go. But by that time, other people were living in our house. We were offered a place in Den Helder where nobody knew us, so I went to trade school there. And why didn't you go back to high school? You really don't understand anything, do you? Fake screwed up his face as if he smelled something rotten. What do you think? My mother had to become a cleaning woman to support me and my sisters. You know, one of those women with a rag around their head and a shopping bag like you see in the streets at 6:30 in the morning. The bag was to carry her brushes and mops and soaps. She had to buy those herself. When she came home at night, she walked slower and slower, and now she's in the hospital, if you really want to know, with water running out of her right leg. That one is all yellow with brown spots. The left one was amputated 2 weeks ago. Now are you satisfied, doctor? He emptied his glass, slammed it down on the table, and leaned back. So that's the difference, right? We're in the same class, your parents are shot, but you're doing medical studies all the same, whereas my father was shot, and I repair water heaters. But your mother is alive, said Anton promptly, and your sisters too. Now he weighed his words carefully. They were on dangerous ground. Besides, isn't there some difference between your father's and my parents' deaths? What difference? Fake asked aggressively. My parents were innocent. My father, too, he said without a moment's hesitation, his eyes on Anton. Anton, amazed, kept silent. Perhaps Fake actually meant it. Perhaps he was really convinced of it. All right, said Anton at last with a conciliatory gesture. All right, I only know what I heard, but exactly. But if it really is your opinion that social injustice caused the difference between us, then I don't understand that stone. With his head, he motioned to the ugly stone that was still lying an insult on his grand piano. Then, you should have been a communist instead. Before Fake answered, he took the glass and poured the last drop down his throat. Communism, he said calmly, but with an undertone of rage, is the worst. Just look at the Budapest, where an entire people's drive for freedom is being drowned in blood. Fake, said Anton, irritated. I'm no communist either, but that doesn't mean I find it necessary to learn those headlines by heart. Sure, of course, Dr. Steenschwick is clever enough to say it better in his own words. Excuse me if I'm not that smart. People are killing each other over there. Is that any better? Why do you suppose the political commissionaries are doing over there? There's mass murder going on over there. Didn't you know? Did you read Het Peru about the atrocities being committed by the Mongol soldiers? Mongol soldiers, Anton said. What do you mean, Fake? Has the time come now to send Mongols to the gas chamber? No, you bastard, said Fake with a threatening look. I'm not sure what you're getting at, but I can tell you one thing. At least my father was absolutely right about the communist. He used to predict everything that's going on now. It's no coincidence that it was the same damned communists who killed him. That same bunch that you see now, running over the rooftop with helmets on their lousy head. Why are you defending them anyway? Remember, they knew very well that there would be reprisals. Yet, they shot him down in front of your house. They couldn't have cared less, otherwise they'd taken the trouble to hide the body. Besides, it didn't end the war 1 second sooner. He stood up and took his glass over to the table where Anton had left the open beer bottle. Anton noticed that the stove wasn't burning. He stood up, tore a strip from a newspaper, lit it, and dropped it into the black, shiny layer of oil. He poured another glass of wine. And, because Fake remained standing, Anton did too. Outside, there was more shouting and the sound of sirens. My family, said Anton, massaging his neck with his empty hands, was not executed by the communists, but by your father's friends. But those communists knew what would happen. Therefore, they were to blame? Right. Who else? Fake, said Anton. I understand that you want to defend your father. He was, after all, your father. But if your father had been my father, if everything had been turned around, would you be defending Fake Plug? Let's not kid each other. Your father was killed by the communists with premeditation because they had decided that it was essential. But your family was senselessly slaughtered. But my family was senselessly slaughtered by fascists, of whom your father was one. Isn't that right? Fake turned his back to Anton and remained motionless, bent slightly forward, and he asked, Are you implying that it was my father's fault that your family was murdered? Now, Anton realized every word mattered. Above the mantelpiece hung a tall mirror with an intricately carved frame, brought from a song of the flea market to make his room look bigger. In the weathered glass, he saw that Fake had closed his eyes. Why can't you love with your father without trying to whitewash him? Asked Anton. After all, it doesn't take much to love a saint. That's like loving animals. Why don't you simply say, my father was definitely a collaborator, but he was still my father and I loved him. But damn it, he was not a collaborator, at least not in the way you're implying. But suppose you knew for certain, Anton said to his back, that he had done terrible things. God knows. Just name something. Would you still love him? Fake turned around, looked at him briefly, and began to pace up and down the room. Collaborating, he said after a while. That's what they call it. And yet now they all think the way he did about communism. Listen to what's going on out there. What's the difference between that and the Eastern Front? And all that stuff about the Jews. He didn't know a thing about that. He was ignorant of all that. You can't blame him for it. What the Germans did to them. He was the police and simply did his duty what he was told. Even before the war, he had to arrest people, and he didn't know what would happen to them either. Of course, he was a fascist, but a good one, out of conviction. Things would have changed in Holland. It shouldn't ever go back to the way it was under Minister Kolgen, when my father had to fire on workers. At least, he didn't just follow the crowd like most Hollanders. If Hitler had won the war, how many people in Holland would still be against him now, do you suppose? Don't make me laugh, man. Not till they saw that Hitler was losing did they all suddenly belong to the resistance. Those yellow bastards. The stove in which he had put too much oil began to sputter in dull, rhythmic spurts. Fake gave it a professional glance and said, "That's never going to work." But he would not be distracted. With his glass in both hands, he sat down on the window seat and asked, "Do you know when my father became a member of the National Socialist Party?" "In September 1944, after Mad Tuesday, when the whole thing was as good as lost, and all those phony fascists fled to Germany, or suddenly had always belonged to the resistance. That's when he thought it was time to take a stand. My mother often told us this, and because of his conviction, they shot him, for nothing else, and that's what cost your family their lives. If the communists hadn't done that, your father and mother would still be here today. Possibly my father would have spent a couple years in prison, and by now he would be back simply working for the police." He straightened up and walked to the piano, on which he played a few notes in the middle register. The sound, mixed with the sputtering of the stove, reminded Anton of Starvin' Sky. Each word of Fake's made his head ache worse. How could anyone embroil himself in such a web of lies? Love was what caused it all. Love, through thick and thin. "To hear you tell it," he said, "your father's name belongs on that monument, too." "What monument?" "The one back there on the quay." "Is there a monument?" "I didn't find out till much later myself. It had my parents' names and those of the 29 hostages." "Should Fake Plog be on it, too?" Fake looked at him and wanted to say something, then suddenly began to sob. The sobs rose out of him as if they belonged to someone else who was inhabiting his body. "Shit," he said, but it was unclear whether he was replying to Anton's question or angry with himself for crying. "As your house went up in flames, we got the news that our father was dead. Did you ever think of that? I've thought of what you went through. Did you ever think the same for me?" He turned toward him, then away, passed his hand over his eyes in despair, and suddenly grabbed the stone. He looked at Anton, who raised his arms to his head in self-defense and cried, "Fake!" Fake took aim and threw it straight at the mirror. Anton ducked. With averted face, he saw the glass break into large pieces that landed in splinters on the iron lid of the stove, which was now sputtering feebly. The stone bounced onto the mantelpiece and remained lying there. Surveying the damage with a pounding heart, he heard Fake's footsteps run down the stairs. A final fragment slipped out of the frame and shattered into pieces. Immediately after, the lid of the stove blew off with a dull thud 5 centimeters up into the air, and let out a cloud of soot. Anton crossed his hands behind his neck, cracked his fingers, and took a deep breath. He felt on the verge of hysterical laughter. The shattered mirror, the exploding stove, the screaming in the street. With his headache, he couldn't stand it. How senseless all this. The soot spread through the room, and he knew it would take hours to clean it up. He heard Fake come back up the stairs. Only then did he realize that the street door had never closed. Instinctively, he looked around for something to defend himself with. He seized his tennis racket. Fake appeared in the doorway and glanced briefly at the disorder in the room. "I wanted to tell you," Fake said, "that I'll never forget that time in the classroom." "What time in the classroom?" "That time you came in when I was sitting there with my monkey suit." "Oh, God, yes," said Anton. "That happened, too." Fake hesitated. Perhaps he wanted to shake hands, but just raised one briefly and went downstairs again. A minute later, the door slammed its lock. Anton looked about. All his things were covered with a veil of grease. The books and the sextants were the worst. Fortunately, the piano had been closed. First, he had to clean up, headache or no headache. He drew the curtains and opened the windows wide. As the noise invaded the room, he looked at the shards. On the reverse side, they were a dull black. Only a few sharp splinters were stuck in the frame, which encircled nothing but dark brown wood that had once been papered over with newspapers, now mostly torn off. The 2 gilt putti, with their fruit platter and tails made of curled leaves, looked down at him with unchanged angelic expressions. First, he must get rid of the stone. He might simply throw it out of the window. Carefully, so as not to slip on the glass lying on the straw carpet, he went to the mantelpiece. Holding the stone in his hand, he read a fragment of a strip of newspaper sticking to the wooden back of the mirror. Nil di Luglio, 1845, Solenzima dosi con sacra devota porma blah 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 blah. On the 2nd of July, 1854, celebrated with sacred ceremony at the Church of Blessed Mary of Perpetual Help. One more thing he would have never found if it hadn't been for Fake.